Welcome to the second module of the Using Less in SAS course. My name is Sean Wildermuth with Agilitrain. In this module, we're going to be talking about the dynamic style sheet language called less. First, we're going to explore what less is and how it solves some of these basic problems with CSS. We're going to show you how to use less directly on HTML pages, as well as how to integrate them with ASP.NET. Then we're going to talk about importing, using variables, functions, operations, mix-ins, nested rules, and finally some other features that round out the language. So when we talk about less, we talk about it as a dynamic style sheet language. So instead of just being the basic style sheets themselves, it's a language that brings in some basic pieces of functionality that allow you to create richer sorts of style sheets. The idea behind less is that it is a simple language that then compiles down to CSS. This is normally a transform operation, whether it's on the client or the server, to produce CSS, since that's really what the browser is expecting. It introduces these programming features to CSS, but the language looks and feels just like CSS. In fact, all CSS is valid less. So if you've got a CSS file and you simply rename it to a less file, it is a completely valid less document. So let's start and talk about how we actually use less on the client so that as we start to build less files, we can see them work on the client. The way this works is there is a less.js file that you can use from the lesscss.org website. What you're going to do is bring in a link of a less file, and the rel tag is going to point at stylesheet/less instead of the typical stylesheet/CSS. This is what is going to tell the JavaScript file what kinds of resources are these less files. Then here you're going to need to include the less.js file, and this is what actually transforms the less file into CSS directly on the client. Let's see how that works. So here we are in Visual Studio, and we've got a simple HTML file with a few CSS files. Now, less itself is not going to process or deal with CSS files that aren't in your domain and aren't things that are under your control. So these first two CSS files that are actually style sheets to get some open source fonts from the Google APIs domain, we're going to leave alone. So we can mix CSS with less on the same page, not a problem. To get started with using less in the client, we can go ahead and simply rename our CSS file here in the Solution Explorer as a less file. Visual Studio is going to say, do you want to change it? And we do. And you'll notice that it loses its icon because it doesn't know exactly what to do with this less file. Because we've changed it here to less, we're going to change it here in our form also to less. Now, so far we're just pulling down that less file, but we're really not telling the browser that it knows what to do with a less file. So in order to do that, we're going to actually need the JavaScript file from the lesscss.org website. I've got it cached locally on my desktop. And it's just called less.js, but in this case there's version information. Less 121 is the version I'm using, and this is a minimized version for you to use in your website. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag and drop it so that we can bring it into our head. You could put this script anywhere on the page where you want this to be processed, but it should be after all spreadsheets have been declared. If it happens before, it may not find the spreadsheet files that you want it to process. By just including this, it's going to actually look through the DOM for links of the right type that are less files. Now, because less aren't necessarily served as .less files, that's not actually how it finds these links. It finds them by looking at a certain rel attribute. So we have to change this to be spreadsheet/less for this to actually work. What the browser is going to do is pull down this less file, but not really do anything with it because it doesn't know that it's CSS. And then the script is going to do the fix-ups for us. Let's go ahead and run it now that we've done this. Now, note we've changed the file to a my.less file, but we haven't actually done any less in there. So this should still be treated as a perfectly valid CSS. And we can tell it is because we're getting our appropriate design. If we close this and change and remove this less part of it and run it, our CSS is missing. And the reason for this is the server, when it serves up these less files, may or may not know what the content type is. Because in this case, it doesn't know what the content type is, it's delivering them as plain text, so the browser doesn't expect that it's a valid CSS file. We don't care whether it's being treated by the browser as CSS because the JavaScript file on the client is doing that work for us. Let's put the less back there. And let's go ahead and just add a quick line of actual processing code so we can see it actually work. I'm going to open up our myless file, and this worked, remember, because every CSS file is also valid less. Less looks and feels like CSS. So let's just use a simple variable. The variable syntax, which we'll cover in a lot more detail in a few minutes in this video, it's just an @ sign, the name of a variable, colon, and then some value. And I'm going to just call it main color. And I'm just going to say pink, since it'll be nice and obvious that this is the color we're using. Once we've declared one of these variables, we can use them anywhere we want. And I'll just replace our body tag with this main color. So the less processor is going to take that main color pink and just replace it anywhere it is in the file. It is just pre-processing this file to eventually deliver valid CSS. Let's go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and just run this again in the browser. Well, see, it's done its job. It's actually replaced this CSS in the browser with that pink value. And if we look at using the debugger, our HTML body tag, we can see that the background is actually pink. It actually replaced that specific value in the body style with that value we had put in the less file. We'll see more how variables work in a couple of minutes. And that's how you can use less directly from the client without changing the server whatsoever. So more commonly, you're going to actually process the less files on the server. And there's a few reasons for doing this. There's the ability to cache it. There's reducing the processing time on the client itself. Allows you to scale out your HTML a little better. I prefer to do the less on the server unless I really don't have a choice. There are cases where I can't really run any special code on the server and I'm just delivering HTML, and then the client-side code is perfectly acceptable. There is server support in less for Node.js, ASP.NET, as well as other packages for Rails, JSP, and other solutions. Let's talk about Node.js and ASP.NET. Then we're going to concentrate on the ASP.NET example. In Node, all that's really required is for you to go ahead and use the Node package manager to install less. This will install it on the server, and this will allow you to, in your code, go ahead and require less as part of your project, and then just use the less class to render contents. And this is going to be a file, and then it's just simply going to render the some part of the page. For ASP.NET, there's actually a NuGet package for less. It's actually developed by a different group of guys that have ported less, which was primarily a Ruby implementation, to .NET so that you can use it in ASP.NET. The trick there is to just open up the package manager and just install the dotless package. You could also use the UI, which is what we'll do in our example in a minute, to install this package. This will allow dotless files to just be processed on the server without having to do anything special on the individual pages. Let's show you how dotless and less work together. So here we are in Visual Studio with our less file. And this is just as the original CSS was. We're going to do some refactoring to bring in some of these less extensions that'll help us. First thing I want to do is I've noticed that there's a couple of places where we're using black as a color, in the case of background and text color, and I hate that we're using magic strings there, so I'm going to go ahead and throw in a variable, and I'll call it our main color, and I'll just say it's black. Now, less is going to allow us to call it black here, or even say black. Whatever the value here is what it's going to replace. It's not going to interpret one color over another. I'll just copy that and use it in the couple of places we're using just black, which is here in the body's main color. And then on our container, we're also using it for the foreground color of our container. And if we run this in the browser, we refresh because there was some browser cache going on, we can see we're getting that. Our main container is using black as the main color as well as that background. Let's come up here to the color and let's change this to green. We can see it changed not only the background here, but also all the text colors in here, because we changed it in one place and it's propagating that because it's processing the less to all those other places. Let's use a couple of other ideas here. First is commenting. So let's say we want to take the padding out of our container. Instead of having to wrap it with the CSS style commenting, we can simply just put double slashes in front of it, because that is a comment style that is supported in less. And there we can see our padding disappeared. We can go ahead and get rid of that and watch it reappear, that small padding we had. The other thing that you can do that's not so obvious is this notion of how imports work. So when you're importing a CSS file, it does exactly the same thing that CSS does, which is tell the browser to go ahead and import that file as a second separate CSS to include in this main CSS. Let's go ahead and take our init.css here and let's go ahead and change it to a less file. And this is significant because we can tell less that we want to import another less file, and in the syntax of less, you can either specify it as less or just not include an extension, and it'll assume it is less. Let's go ahead and press F5. Save this and view it in the browser, and nothing is any different here, except it really is. Let's look at what happens with our less file here. Now, why do we have all this magic here on top? The reason we do is it is literally taken what is the content of our init.less, and during processing it has merged it into this file. And so this is another way where you can build larger CSS files from a lot of smaller less files in one fell swoop, and it allows you to create that modularization without worrying about a bunch of round trips. Sometimes with CSS you decide to not break it up into individual files because you want fewer round trips to the server to pull them back. In this case, it's actually batching them together into a single file. Let's create a new file so we can see what this actually looks like. So there isn't a less file here, but we can look for a CSS file or even a text file. And I'm just going to call this our colors.less. And this is a pretty common approach where you have different sorts of categories of items that you're going to be included in other files. And I'll go ahead and take our color we defined here. I'll take it out of our main less file and put it in our colors. As long as I import the colors file, it's still going to work. Because what it's done is it's brought in those less extensions that we've had there and is just using for the pre-processing. We could look at the less and see that the processing worked, but that line of the variable is going to disappear because it's only used as a processing instruction, if you want to think about it in that way. Let's head back to the slides.